Welcome to nowhere. Danny Barrett had seen just about everything a small-town police force could throw at him. He'd worked in bustling cities and quiet towns, handling cases that ran the gamut from minor misdemeanors to heavy felonies. At 54, he'd weathered more than his share of trials. Yet, when he accepted the job of police chief in the quiet, remote town of Copperfield, South Carolina, he'd hoped this move would allow him to ease into a slower pace, away from the rush of his past. It was a place where the pace of life matched the heat of the lazy summer air. A town slow to change, wary of outsiders, and content with its own ways. Copperfield was like a postcard from a forgotten time. The main street was lined with worn-out shops, and the town square featured a single statue of a long-gone hero that had likely witnessed more history than any of the current residents. Danny stepped out of his car, a vintage Crown Vic he'd held onto from his earliest days on the force, and took in the scenery. He breathed in the humid air, full of the faint scent of pine and dust, feeling both out of place and oddly at peace. But he couldn't shake a feeling, the kind that settled in your bones, nagging at you. He had dealt with towns like this before, places where outsiders were seen as trouble, especially if they intended to change the way things worked. And in a town like Copperfield, a black man arriving as the new police chief was bound to shake things up more than a bit. He brushed off the uneasy feeling as he strolled into town, thinking it was just first-day nerves. He didn't wear his uniform today, figuring it might be better to observe and get a sense of Copperfield without the immediate attention his badge would bring. In a worn-out cap and a faded jacket, Danny walked through the streets, watching the locals. He took note of the gossipers in the town square, the folks at the hardware store, and the school kids making their way home. Everywhere he looked, he felt eyes on him, curious, cautious, and not entirely welcoming. His feet carried him into the Copper Kettle Cafe, a little coffee shop that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the chatter ceased almost immediately. Danny felt the weight of dozens of eyes as the cafe's patrons turned their attention toward him, assessing him in a way that only a small-town crowd could. Copperfield was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and it was clear that he wasn't part of that everyone. "Coffee, black," he said to the young woman behind the counter, her wide eyes never leaving his face. She nodded silently, fumbling as she poured the coffee, her gaze darting toward the two cops sitting in the corner booth. Danny felt a twinge of amusement as he noticed them. They looked more like high school bullies than officers of the law. He'd seen their type before, men who wore their badges like they were crowns, lording over the few square miles they considered their kingdom. One of them, a tall man with a thick build, smirked as he looked Danny up and down. The other, shorter and wiry, snickered under his breath. "Hey there, stranger," the tall cop called out. "Haven't seen you round here before. Just passing through, are ya?" Danny raised his coffee cup in acknowledgement but kept quiet, assessing them. He knew that sometimes letting people reveal their intentions was the best tactic. The wiry one leaned back, crossing his arms. "You look a little lost, friend. This here's Copperfield. Not much to see. Might be better if you just kept on your way." Danny's face remained impassive. He sipped his coffee, letting the silence linger before speaking. "Just getting a feel for the place, is all. Taking in the sights." The tall cop laughed, a rough, mocking sound. "Oh, we got plenty to see. How about you stick around a while? I'm sure the folks here would just love to welcome you properly." There was an edge to his words that made it clear the welcome he had in mind wasn't the friendly kind. Danny met their stares without flinching, silently measuring them. He had been around enough rough cops to know the look of men who enjoyed power for its own sake. These two weren't outliers in Copperfield. They were part of the town's fabric, part of a status quo that didn't like to be questioned. But the thing about status quo was, it rarely stood up well to scrutiny. Finishing his coffee, he set the cup down and nodded at the two officers, a slight smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "Well, you all have a good day now." As he turned to leave, He caught sight of the young woman behind the counter, watching him with a strange mixture of concern and curiosity. He gave her a reassuring nod and walked out, feeling the eyes of the entire cafe on his back. His instinct had been right. Copperfield was the kind of town that preferred things its way, and anyone who didn't fit that mold wasn't likely to be met with open arms. Later that evening, as Danny settled into his small rented apartment just outside of town, he allowed himself a quiet chuckle. Those two cops, Jake and Mike, he'd overheard, probably figured him to be a drifter or some out-of-town stranger. They had no idea that he was the one coming in to take charge of their precinct, to oversee them. A wave of amusement washed over him as he thought about the shock that would cross their faces when they saw him in uniform, sitting behind the desk they likely assumed would always be occupied by someone just like them. His thoughts drifted to the task ahead of him. He knew that taking over a precinct in a town like Copperfield was going to be a challenge, but he was no stranger to challenges. Danny had been tested in far tougher places, with far harder cases. The stakes were different here, though. This wasn't about chasing down criminals or solving crimes. This was about reshaping a system that had been left unchecked for too long. As the night deepened, he went over his mental list, preparing for the days ahead. He'd need to meet with the town council, make his rounds at the station, and introduce himself to the community. Most importantly, he'd need to establish himself with the officers, many of whom, he was certain, would share Jake and Mike's small-minded views. The next morning, as Danny dressed in his crisp new uniform and polished his badge, he looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath. He knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't come to Copperfield looking for easy. He'd come here to make a difference, to bring a new standard of respect and accountability. This town didn't know it yet, but change was coming, whether they liked it or not. He adjusted his hat, took one last look in the mirror, and headed out the door, ready to introduce himself not as some stranger, but as the new chief of police. It was time to bring a new era to Copperfield, starting with a little meeting with two officers who had no idea what was coming their way. The lay of the land. As Danny drove toward the station in his official car, the morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees lining the road. He had chosen this small, forgotten town, hoping it would allow him to use his years of experience to guide a quieter force, one not plagued by the politics of big city policing. But his initial encounter with Jake and Mike the day before had been a stark reminder that trouble often lurked in the least expected places. The Copperfield Police Department was a modest building tucked away behind the town's courthouse. As Danny pulled into the lot, he took a moment to assess the place. Unlike the bustling precincts he was used to, this station seemed more like a clubhouse than a workplace, with worn furniture and faded paint that seemed to reflect a department untouched by time. Danny wasn't interested in cosmetics, though. He was here to make real, lasting changes. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed several officers lingering outside, leaning against patrol vehicles, exchanging laughter, and casting him a few suspicious glances. Their conversation hushed as he approached, each man silently sizing him up. They knew he was coming. His arrival had been announced weeks ago. But Danny could see the doubt in their eyes, the unease that simmered just beneath the surface. One officer, a man in his 40s with a weathered face and hard, squinting eyes, stepped forward. He extended his hand, though his expression remained guarded. "Chief Barrett, welcome to Copperfield," he said in a gruff tone. Danny shook his hand firmly, reading the name embroidered on his uniform. Sergeant Keller. Keller seemed to carry an air of authority, likely the unofficial leader of the department in the absence of a strong chief. The other officers hovered nearby, waiting to see what would unfold, but none seemed eager to introduce themselves. "Thank you, Sergeant Keller," Danny replied, looking him directly in the eye. "It's good to finally be here. I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone and seeing how things run around here." Keller's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a quiet town, Chief. We don't see much excitement out here. Mostly just keeping the peace and making sure things stay in order. Danny nodded. That's what I'm here for, to keep the peace and to make sure things are running smoothly. He glanced around at the other officers, giving each a slight nod. I'd like to meet everyone over the next few days. We'll be doing things a little differently now, but I believe we can build a strong team together. His words were met with a few exchanged looks and barely concealed smirks. Keller's face remained impassive, but Danny noticed a flicker of amusement in his eyes. We'll do our best to help you settle in, Chief, Keller said, though his tone carried a hint of irony. Copperfield's not like those big cities. Folks here like things to stay the way they've always been. It's comfortable that way. Danny resisted the urge to sigh. He knew Keller's words were a veiled warning, a reminder that change wasn't always welcome in places like Copperfield. But Danny had never been one to back down from a challenge. As he moved past the group of officers and into the building, he could feel their eyes on him, judging him, likely wondering how long he'd last before he either gave up or adapted to their way of doing things. But Danny wasn't here to blend in. He was here to lead. Inside, the station was quiet, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and dust. Desks were scattered across the main room, each piled with papers and personal trinkets. A small break room sat to the left, its walls covered in fading photos of fishing trips, softball games, and other departmental gatherings. A reminder of the camaraderie these officers shared, one that Danny knew would take time to infiltrate. He was reviewing the precinct's files when the station door swung open, and two familiar figures strolled in, laughing boisterously. Jake and Mike, the two officers he'd encountered at the cafe, barely acknowledged him as they walked past, still chuckling over some private joke. Their laughter halted abruptly when they looked up and saw Danny standing there in uniform, his polished badge gleaming. Jake's face fell, his mouth opening in surprise as he stared at Danny. You're the new chief." Danny raised an eyebrow, suppressing a smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. Nice to see you again." The color drained from Mike's face as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Chief, didn't realize it was you yesterday," he stammered, his bravado evaporating. "Didn't realize it was me," Danny echoed, his voice steady. "Or didn't care?" The question hung in the air, and Danny could see the uncomfortable shift in their posture. He kept his gaze on them, letting the silence stretch. He had learned long ago that silence was a powerful tool, often forcing people to confront their own discomfort. Finally, Jake cleared his throat, his voice thick with forced confidence. "We didn't mean anything by it, Chief. Just, thought you were another outsider." "An outsider," Danny repeated, his tone cool. "I see. Well, gentlemen, I'm here now, and I expect every officer under my command to show respect, not just to me, but to everyone in this town. Do I make myself clear?" The two men nodded quickly, their earlier arrogance reduced to sheepish obedience. Danny knew their submission wouldn't last. Men like Jake and Mike thrived on power dynamics, and they'd likely test him again before long. But for now, he was content with the small victory. Later that day, Danny called a meeting with all the officers. They gathered in the station's small conference room, filling the space with murmured conversations and guarded glances. Keller stood in the back, his arms crossed, watching Danny with a look that was difficult to read. "Thank you all for being here," Danny began, standing at the front of the room. "I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and to share a bit about what I hope to accomplish here in Copperfield." He glanced around the room, meeting each officer's gaze. "I know I'm new here, and I understand that change isn't always easy. But my goal isn't to disrupt things for the sake of it. My goal is to make sure that we're serving this community to the best of our ability, treating everyone with respect, and upholding the values that our badges represent." A few officers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. Danny continued, undeterred. "I've been in this line of work for a long time, and I've seen what happens when officers lose sight of what it means to serve. I want to build a department where every officer feels proud to wear the badge, not because it gives them power, but because it gives them a responsibility." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And that responsibility extends to every citizen in this town, no matter who they are, where they're from, or how long they've lived here. We are here to protect and serve. Nothing more, nothing less." Keller's expression remained neutral, but Danny could sense a shift in the room. Some of the officers nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Others, like Jake and Mike, stared at the floor, unwilling to meet his gaze. "I understand that this might be a different approach than what you're used to," Danny continued, "but I'm here to support each of you, and I'm here to listen. If you have questions, concerns, or ideas, my door is always open." With that, he dismissed the meeting, allowing the officers to file out. A few lingered, casting curious glances his way. One younger officer, a woman named Officer Green, approached him, her face lit with a faint smile. "Chief Barrett," she said, her voice soft but sincere, "I think it's good you're here. Copperfield could use some change." Danny nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to remind him that change, however gradual, was possible. He thanked her, watching as she walked out, her steps lighter than when she'd entered. As the day wound down, Danny sat at his desk, reflecting on the events so far. He knew this journey wouldn't be easy, that there were still hurdles ahead. But he also knew that he had come to Copperfield for a reason. And as long as he stayed true to that purpose, he would find a way to reach the heart of this town. One officer, one citizen, one moment at a time. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come, he was certain of it. Lines in the sand. Danny's third day as chief began with an uneasy calm. He could feel the tension lingering in the air, thick and unspoken. The town itself seemed unaware of the quiet battle lines being drawn at the precinct. On the surface, Copperfield moved along as it always had. Children walked to school in the brisk morning air. Shopkeepers arranged their displays, and neighbors exchanged greetings on the way to the diner. But at the station, an undercurrent simmered. Danny knew this was a pivotal moment, one that could define his relationship with the department and the town. He arrived early, hoping to get a sense of the precinct's rhythm before the other officers filtered in. The station was eerily quiet, and Danny took advantage of the silence to review the old incident logs, eager to get a better understanding of the department's history. As he sifted through the files, he noticed a troubling trend. Minor complaints from residents about officer misconduct, particularly Jake and Mike, but each one had been closed without further investigation. The complaints were mostly from marginalized residents, the elderly, young teenagers, immigrants, and working-class folks who were less likely to challenge authority. Just as he was mulling over the paperwork, Sergeant Keller walked in, giving Danny a quick nod as he poured himself a mug of coffee. Keller seemed cautious but not outright antagonistic. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew the lay of the land and had earned the respect of his peers, for better or worse. "Chief," Keller greeted him, taking a seat across the desk. "Early start today." Danny nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Figured I'd dig through some of these old files. It's always good to understand what's happened in the past before making plans for the future." Keller's face was unreadable as he sipped his coffee, watching Danny closely. "Nothing too exciting in there, Chief. Just a few minor things." Danny met Keller's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Minor things can become major if they're ignored. I want to make sure we're handling things right. Fairly." Keller's mouth twitched in what might have been a smirk. "With all due respect, Chief, this is Copperfield. People don't expect big city policing here. They like things simple." "Simple, I understand," Danny replied, leaning forward slightly. "But there's a difference between simple and careless. And we're in the business of accountability." Keller's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a brief moment, Danny thought he saw a flicker of resentment there. But Keller quickly composed himself, offering a shrug instead. "Sure, Chief. Whatever you say. Danny didn't push further. He knew men like Keller valued face over anything else. Pushing too hard too fast would only backfire. But he could tell that his presence and his approach had unsettled the comfortable routines that Keller and his crew had grown used to. Just as Keller left, Officer Green entered, offering a quick nod as she took a seat at the desk near the back of the room. She glanced toward Danny, giving him a subtle smile that felt like an olive branch. Danny was grateful for her presence. She was one of the few officers who seemed open to change, a glimmer of promise in an otherwise challenging environment. Later that morning, Danny decided to head out into town to visit some of Copperfield's more vulnerable residents, the ones who had filed complaints or had reported mistreatment in the past. He wanted to hear their stories directly, to let them know they had someone in their corner now. It was a risky move. He knew that walking into these neighborhoods as the new chief might raise eyebrows, especially if word got back to the officers who had dismissed these complaints. But he also knew that he couldn't lead this town without understanding the struggles of the people he'd sworn to protect. His first stop was a small, weathered home on the edge of town belonging to Mrs. Hattie Lovern, an elderly woman in her 70s who'd been living in Copperfield her whole life. Her complaint was buried deep in the logs, but it caught Danny's attention. She had reported feeling intimidated by Officer Mike, who had accused her of causing trouble after she'd spoken up about the way he treated the neighborhood kids. Hattie greeted Danny with a cautious smile, peering at him from behind thick-rimmed glasses as he introduced himself. She led him into her small living room, where he noticed a mix of old family photos and mementos from her life in Copperfield, a reminder that this was her home, her place of belonging. "Chief Barrett, is it?" she said, settling into a worn armchair. "Well, I wasn't expecting to see the new chief knocking on my door." Danny offered a warm smile, hoping to put her at ease. "Just Danny's fine, Mrs. Lovern. I wanted to come by and hear from you. I've been going over some old records and noticed you had a few run-ins with one of our officers. I'd like to hear your side of things if you're comfortable sharing." Hattie's gaze turned wary. She looked down at her hands, wringing them slowly, as if unsure how much to say. "I don't want any trouble, Chief. I just didn't like the way that officer treated folks around here, especially the kids. It's like he thinks he owns this place, the way he talks to people." Danny leaned forward, listening intently. "You're not causing trouble, Mrs. Lovern. I believe that everyone deserves respect, and I want to make sure that's what you're getting from this department." She looked up, a hint of hope in her eyes. "You really mean that?" "I do," Danny replied. "I can't change what's already happened, but I can promise that things will be different going forward. And if you ever feel mistreated again, I want you to come straight to me." The elderly woman's eyes softened, a faint smile creeping onto her face. "It's good to hear that, Danny. This town needs someone like you. We've been overlooked for too long." They talked a while longer, and Danny left with a sense of purpose renewed. He knew there were countless other stories like Hattie's, people who had simply accepted the status quo because they felt they had no choice. But if he could give them even a little bit of hope, it would be worth it. As the day wore on, Danny visited a few more homes, each one revealing a piece of Copperfield's hidden history. The stories varied, but the theme remained the same: a community that had learned to keep quiet, fearing the consequences of speaking up. By the time he returned to the station that evening, he felt the weight of those stories pressing down on him, urging him to act. Upon entering the station, he was greeted with the sight of Jake and Mike in conversation by the water cooler, their laughter cutting through the quiet atmosphere. They fell silent when they saw him. But Danny noticed a gleam of defiance in Jake's eyes. He knew that word of his visits had likely reached them, and he could sense that they were already bristling at the notion of being held accountable. "Long day, Chief?" Jake asked, his tone dripping with false concern. Danny regarded him steadily. "Long days are part of the job, officer. You'd know that if you were out there putting in the hours." Jake's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "We put in our hours, Chief, But Copperfield doesn't need a city-style overhaul. We keep things simple, just like Sergeant Keller said. No need to fix what ain't broken. Danny's expression hardened. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. It's only broken if you're not the one feeling the cracks. Some folks in this town have been dealing with those cracks for years, and it's our job to make sure those gaps get closed. Understood. Jake's bravado faltered, but he managed to nod, his expression bitter. Understood, Chief. Mike shifted uncomfortably beside him, avoiding Danny's gaze. Yeah, we understand, he mumbled. Danny's gaze lingered on them, unflinching. He knew he had made an enemy in Jake, and likely Mike as well. But he wasn't about to back down. This was his department now, and he intended to run it by a new set of rules, one built on respect and fairness, not intimidation and unchecked power. As the two officers left, Keller appeared in the doorway, arms crossed as he leaned against the frame, watching the scene with an inscrutable expression. "Making friends, Chief?" he asked, his tone neutral. Danny chuckled softly. "Not everyone's here to make friends, Sergeant. Sometimes respect comes first." Keller's eyes narrowed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Well, you're stirring up the pot, that's for sure. But just remember, Chief, folks here don't like outsiders meddling too much in their business." Danny met his gaze squarely. "I'm not here to meddle, Sergeant. I'm here to lead. And if that means stirring the pot, then so be it." Keller regarded him in silence, something unreadable flickering across his face, before he finally gave a slow nod. "Guess we'll see how that goes." Danny watched as Keller walked away, feeling a mix of resolve and trepidation. He knew he was standing on fragile ground, surrounded by officers who either resisted him outright or were watching to see if he'd falter. But he also knew he had a duty, not just to his badge, but to the people of Copperfield who had been silenced for too long. Change wouldn't come easily. But Danny was ready. The gathering storm. As the weeks rolled by, Danny's presence in Copperfield was starting to feel more permanent. The initial shock of his arrival had worn off, but in its place was something far more insidious. Resistance. For some officers, like Officer Green, he was a breath of fresh air, a reminder of the principles they had once sworn to uphold. But for others, particularly Jake and Mike, Danny's influence was a threat. And in a small-town department that thrived on unspoken rules and selective enforcement, that kind of threat couldn't go unchallenged. The tension bubbled up in subtle ways. Danny noticed it in the way conversations would abruptly halt when he entered a room, the way certain reports seemed to mysteriously vanish or get buried under paperwork, and the way a handful of officers avoided eye contact. Jake and Mike, in particular, seemed to go out of their way to undermine his authority, whether it was through minor acts of defiance or by sowing seeds of doubt among their fellow officers. One evening, after a long day of meetings with the town council about increasing the department's accountability standards, Danny returned to the station to find Jake and Mike huddled together, speaking in low voices. Their laughter faded as soon as they noticed him, and they exchanged a quick, knowing glance before going silent. "Something funny, gentlemen?" Danny asked, his tone light, but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for games. Jake straightened, his face a mask of false innocence. "No, Chief. Just going over the shift schedules for next week. Got to make sure everything's covered, right?" Danny gave him a slight nod. "I appreciate the initiative. Just make sure those schedules are fair for everyone." Jake's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a subtle challenge. "Of course, Chief. Fair as can be." Danny knew better than to confront them outright. Men like Jake and Mike relied on petty power plays, the kind designed to test boundaries without breaking any explicit rules. Confronting them directly would only embolden them, turning the quiet insubordination into open rebellion. He needed to outmaneuver them on his own terms, to show them that their games wouldn't shake him. That night, as he reviewed the incident reports from the past few years, he noticed a pattern emerging, a troubling one. Several reports showed signs of heavy redaction, pages missing, or entire cases listed as resolved without any substantial documentation. It was clear to him now that the town had been running its own version of justice for years, overseen by officers who had grown accustomed to holding power without accountability. Danny spent hours sifting through the files, piecing together a story that had been carefully hidden. He saw patterns of selective enforcement. Jake and Mike routinely targeted newcomers, people of color, and anyone who dared question the status quo. Minor infractions were blown out of proportion, while more serious complaints, those involving friends or family of the officers, were conveniently overlooked. By the time he closed the last file, Danny felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about reforming a police department. This was about dismantling a system that had thrived on inequality and intimidation. And if he was going to change things in Copperfield, he needed allies. The following day, Danny called Officer Green into his office. She seemed surprised by the summons, but there was a look of cautious optimism in her eyes as she sat down. "Officer Green," Danny began, "I've been reviewing some of the old reports, and I think it's clear that there have been issues here for quite some time. I'm hoping you can help me understand the lay of the land a bit better." Green hesitated, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might overhear. "Chief, I don't know how much I can say. People in this town, they don't like change. And officers like Jake and Mike, well, they've been here a long time. They have connections." Danny nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. But I also believe in doing what's right. And if there are people in this department who are using their authority for personal gain or intimidation, we need to address that. The people of Copperfield deserve better." Green took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she leaned forward. "There's a lot that goes on, Chief. Jake and Mike, they've always operated by their own rules. Sergeant Keller, too. They've built this network of loyalty, and anyone who steps out of line, who questions the way things are, gets shut down or pushed out." Danny listened intently, his mind racing as he pieced together the dynamics of the department. "And what about the other officers? Are they supportive of this network?" Green hesitated, then shook her head. "Not all of them. Some of us are just trying to do our jobs, to protect this community. But it's hard to speak up when you know that your career or even your safety might be at risk." Danny leaned back, absorbing her words. He realized that he couldn't take on the department's issues alone. He needed to build a coalition, a group of officers who shared his vision for a fair, accountable department. And he knew Green was his first true ally. "Thank you for being honest with me, Officer Green," he said, his tone sincere. "I need people like you if we're going to make real change here. And I promise you, I'm committed to this. We're going to turn things around, one way or another." She nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I'm with you, Chief. Just be careful. People like Jake and Mike don't take kindly to anyone challenging their authority." Over the next few weeks, Danny took a quiet but deliberate approach, identifying the officers who seemed open to his way of doing things. He made small changes, barely noticeable on the surface, but each one aimed at creating an atmosphere of fairness and accountability. He tightened the procedures for reporting misconduct, initiated routine checks on old cases, and encouraged his officers to focus on community engagement rather than intimidation. But Jake and Mike weren't blind to these changes. Their acts of defiance grew bolder. They began showing up late to shifts, dragging their feet on paperwork, and making a show of ignoring Danny's orders. It was clear that they were testing him, daring him to take action. One Friday evening, Danny received a call from a distressed mother who reported that her teenage son had been detained by Jake and Mike for loitering near the town square. According to her, her son had simply been walking home from the local grocery store when the two officers pulled him aside and began questioning him aggressively. Danny's jaw clenched as he listened to her tearful account. This wasn't just misconduct. It was harassment, pure and simple. He assured the mother that he would handle it and immediately drove to the town square. where he found Jake and Mike standing beside a patrol car with a young boy who looked visibly shaken. Danny approached them calmly, his expression impassive. "Evening, gentlemen. Mind explaining what's going on here?" Jake straightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Danny. "Just doing our job, Chief. This kid was acting suspicious. Thought we'd ask him a few questions." The boy looked at Danny, hope flickering in his eyes. Danny could see the fear and confusion on his face, and it stirred something in him, a determination to put an end to this once and for all. "This young man," Danny said evenly, "has every right to walk through his own town without being harassed. Unless you have evidence of a crime, you have no reason to detain him." Mike shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance at Jake. "Come on, Chief. We're just keeping an eye on things, making sure the town stays safe." Danny took a step closer, his voice low but filled with unmistakable authority. "Safety doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from respect. Now, let the boy go and get back to your patrol." Jake's face twisted with resentment, but he released the boy, who bolted down the street, glancing back at Danny with a look of gratitude. As the boy disappeared, Jake turned to Danny, his voice cold and defiant. "You're making a mistake, Chief. This town doesn't need a hero. It needs someone who understands how things work." Danny held his gaze, unflinching. Maybe it's time that changed. That night, Danny knew he had crossed a line, a necessary one, but a dangerous one nonetheless. Jake and Mike wouldn't take this lightly. They thrived on fear and control, and by standing up to them, he had threatened the very foundation of their authority. A few days later, he received an anonymous letter slid under his office door. It was typed, with no signature, but the message was clear. "Leave Copperfield, Chief. You don't belong here. This town doesn't want your kind of law." Danny held the letter in his hands, feeling a mix of anger and resolve. It was a reminder of the stakes, a warning that his efforts to change Copperfield were unwelcome by those who benefited from the old ways. But he also knew that leaving would be the easy way out, the safe way. And if he did that, nothing would ever change. The letter only strengthened his resolve. He was here for a reason, and no amount of intimidation would scare him away. The people of Copperfield deserved better, and as long as he wore the badge, he would do everything in his power to bring justice and integrity back to the town. The storm was brewing, and Danny could feel it coming. But he was ready. The breaking point. The intimidation tactics escalated after Danny received that ominous letter. It seemed as though every time he took a step forward, some unseen force was working to push him 2 steps back. While he continued making strides toward cleaning up the precinct, creating protocols for accountability, and opening channels for complaints, a shadow of defiance lingered, especially around officers like Jake, Mike, and surprisingly, Sergeant Keller, who Danny had initially hoped might be swayed by reason and duty. It began with small incidents. First, his reports were mysteriously delayed, misfiled, or outright missing from the station's records. The printer in his office suddenly stopped working after Jake had been seen tinkering near it, and Officer Green's patrol car developed suspicious mechanical issues right after she'd publicly voiced support for Danny's reforms. Danny knew these acts were meant to unnerve him, to remind him that he wasn't in control, at least not completely. But Danny was not easily shaken. He'd been through enough battles in his career to know when he was being baited. Instead of reacting, he doubled down on his goals, implementing changes that were small but effective, ones that began to cut through the web of corruption within the precinct. Still, he could sense the resentment growing in certain corners of the department, like a snake coiling, waiting to strike. One evening, Danny received a call that would prove to be a turning point in his tenure as chief. It was from Marnie Alvarez, a young single mother who worked the late shift at a diner on the edge of town. She sounded distressed, her voice trembling as she explained that her teenage son, Javier, had been taken in by officers for loitering near the town's main park. This was the same charge Danny had heard several times now, and it usually meant that Jake or Mike was involved. He assured Marnie that he would look into it personally. As he drove to the station, he couldn't shake the feeling of anger building inside him. He knew Jake and Mike had a habit of targeting the town's vulnerable, but this was becoming a pattern of harassment, a game of intimidation designed to remind him. And Copperfield's residents, who really held the reins. When Danny arrived at the station, he found Javier sitting in the holding area, a look of fear mixed with defiance on his face. The boy's eyes widened when he saw Danny approach. "Chief Barrett." Javier's voice was small but hopeful, as though he couldn't believe someone was actually on his side. Danny gave him a reassuring nod. "Don't worry, Javier. We're going to sort this out." As he spoke with Javier, the boy explained that he'd been sitting on a park bench, waiting for his mother to finish her shift so he could walk her home. Jake and Mike had pulled up, accusing him of loitering and demanding he show respect by answering a barrage of questions that had nothing to do with any crime. When Javier had tried to explain himself, the officers had decided to bring him in for questioning. Danny clenched his fists as he listened, anger simmering under his calm exterior. This wasn't policing. It was bullying under the guise of authority. He knew then that his efforts at reform were more than a bureaucratic necessity. They were a moral imperative. Danny led Javier out of the holding area and promised Marnie that he would personally look into the incident. He then walked down the hallway to find Jake and Mike lounging in the break room, sipping coffee as though they had just completed some noble act. The moment they saw him, their expressions hardened, their eyes narrowing in defiance. "Chief," Jake said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Can we help you?" Danny crossed his arms, his gaze steely. "I just spoke with Javier Alvarez. He's the young man you brought in from the park tonight." Mike shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Kid was loitering, Chief. We were just doing our jobs, keeping the place safe." "Safe?" Danny's voice was calm, but it carried an edge that silenced the room. "From a kid sitting on a bench waiting for his mom. That's what you call policing." Jake's smirk faltered. "With all due respect, Chief, we don't need an outsider telling us how to do our jobs. This is Copperfield, and we know how to handle things here." Danny's eyes didn't leave Jake's. "If by handling things, you mean harassing residents who haven't done anything wrong, then you're right. I don't operate that way. And while I'm chief, neither will anyone else." Jake's expression hardened. For a moment, Danny thought he might lash out, but the officer merely clenched his jaw, muttering under his breath, "You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Danny leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then why don't you show me?" The tension between them crackled, unspoken threats hanging in the air. Finally, Jake pushed past him, brushing his shoulder roughly as he stormed out of the room, with Mike following close behind. Danny knew they'd escalate their defiance, but he was beyond the point of caring about their loyalty. The stakes had changed. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was a matter of principle. In the days that followed, things began to unravel faster than Danny anticipated. Officers who had previously been neutral now seemed to waver, torn between loyalty to the old guard and the new values Danny represented. Even Sergeant Keller, who had maintained a careful balance, started showing signs of irritation, his support for Danny noticeably cooling. One afternoon, Danny received a call from the town council's chairman, Samuel Brock, a longtime resident and influential figure in Copperfield. Brock's tone was polite, but carried an undercurrent of reprimand. "Chief Barrett," Brock began, "we've been getting some concerns from the community. Certain individuals feel that your approach might be a bit heavy-handed, maybe even disruptive to the harmony we have here." Danny bristled, keeping his voice steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Brock, I'm here to enforce the law fairly. I won't tolerate harassment or abuse of power, not from my officers, and not in this community." Brock hesitated, then sighed. "I understand your intentions, Chief, but this is a small town. People don't like change. You're stirring things up in a way that might not be beneficial." Danny's grip tightened on the phone. He knew what Brock was implying. that his actions were making waves among the more influential families and figures in Copperfield, people who were used to bending the rules in their favor. "With all due respect, Mr. Brock," Danny replied, "I didn't come here to keep the peace at the expense of justice. If there are officers abusing their power, they need to be held accountable, regardless of who their friends are." Brock's tone cooled noticeably. "Just be mindful, Chief. Copperfield doesn't take kindly to outsiders who come in and try to change everything overnight." Danny ended the call with a feeling of resolve. He was aware now that his real challenge wasn't just Jake, Mike, or even Keller. It was a system that had thrived on complicity and silence. This town, in its insistence on keeping the peace, had turned a blind eye to the injustices that plagued its most vulnerable. That Friday evening, as Danny was locking up the station, he received a frantic call from Officer Green. She was breathless, her voice trembling with urgency. "Chief, you need to get to the old mill. Now. It's Jake and Mike. They're with a couple of the locals, and I think they're planning to teach you a lesson." Danny's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Stay where you are, Green. I'm on my way." The drive to the mill was tense, the evening shadows lengthening as he sped down the narrow, winding road. He'd heard of lessons like this before, methods used to discipline those who didn't fall in line, but he had come too far to back down now. If Jake and Mike thought they could scare him off, they were about to learn otherwise. As he approached the old mill, he saw several trucks parked outside, their headlights casting eerie beams onto the crumbling building. Shadows moved within, and Danny's instincts kicked into high gear. He parked a safe distance away and approached the building on foot, his hand resting on the handle of his flashlight, ready to confront whatever was waiting for him. Inside, he found Jake, Mike, and a small group of local men gathered around a makeshift circle. A fire flickered nearby, casting a hellish glow across their faces. Jake looked up as Danny entered, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Well, look who decided to join the party," he sneered, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "Thought you'd like to see how we deal with people who don't know their place." Danny stepped forward, unafraid. "If you're trying to scare me, you'll have to do better than a campfire story." Jake's grin twisted into a snarl. "This isn't a story, Chief. This is reality. You think you can just waltz into our town, tear down everything we've built, and change things without paying the price?" Danny met his gaze, unwavering. "The only thing I'm tearing down is the corruption and intimidation you've built around yourselves. This town deserves better than you." For a moment, it seemed as though Jake might launch at him, but then Mike stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with, Barrett. People like us, this town was built on our backs. You're just a visitor, and visitors don't get to make the rules." Danny's voice was calm but firm. "I'm not here to make the rules, Mike. I'm here to enforce them. And I suggest you start thinking about which side of the law you want to stand on." The group fell silent, tension thick in the air. Danny could feel the weight of their hatred, their resentment, but he also knew that their power, however strong it seemed, was based on fear and control, two things he refused to bow to. One by one, the men began to back down, realizing that Danny wouldn't be intimidated. Jake and Mike lingered, their faces contorted with fury, but even they seemed to understand that the tide was shifting. As Danny walked out of the mill, he knew that the battle was far from over. But he also knew that he had made his stand, that he had shown Copperfield he wouldn't be swayed by threats or fear. The storm had come, and he was still standing. A reckoning. The encounter at the mill changed everything. Danny's presence in Copperfield was no longer just an inconvenient shakeup. He was now a force that neither Jake, Mike, nor the town's power brokers could ignore. The whispers grew louder in town, with locals speculating on whether Danny would bring the storm crashing down on Copperfield, or if he'd be driven out like so many others who'd tried to change things. Danny could feel the eyes of the entire town on him, each gaze carrying its own weight of expectation, resentment, or hope. The following morning, Danny walked into the precinct with a renewed resolve. The officers fell silent when he entered, their eyes flicking from him to each other, anticipation mixed with a sense of dread. Jake and Mike were nowhere in sight, which didn't surprise him. After the confrontation, he'd expected them to regroup, maybe even try to rally support from their allies within the precinct. But Danny wasn't waiting for them to make their next move. He had his own plan, and he was ready to put it into action. Danny summoned Sergeant Keller into his office. Keller entered slowly, his expression unreadable as he took a seat across from Danny. They sat in silence for a moment, each man assessing the other. Danny broke the silence, his voice calm but edged with determination. "Keller, I'm going to need your cooperation on this," he began, his gaze steady. "We can't keep running a department that operates on intimidation and selective enforcement. This town deserves better, and so do the good officers on this force." Keller's face remained impassive, but Danny could sense the subtle shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened slightly. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been here long enough to know that things aren't as simple as you think. People around here, they don't like change, especially if it comes from an outsider." Danny leaned forward, his voice firm. "This isn't about me being an outsider. It's about the people who are supposed to feel safe around us, not intimidated. I need to know, Keller, are you willing to support this vision? Or are you content with the way things are?" Keller hesitated, his eyes flicking downward before he met Danny's gaze again. "I've seen officers come and go, Chief, and I've seen men like Jake and Mike, good at heart, maybe, but they've let power get to them. They're not as simple as they seem, and neither is this town. You're not just up against a few bad apples. You're up against years of people letting things slide because it's easier than facing the truth." Danny took a deep breath, weighing Keller's words. "I understand that, Keller, but that's why it has to change now. We can't keep looking the other way, not anymore." Keller seemed to consider this, his expression softening just a fraction. "If you're serious about this, then I'll do what I can to back you up. But I can't guarantee that everyone else will fall in line." "That's all I'm asking for," Danny replied. "Let's start by reviewing every misconduct complaint that's been filed in the last 5 years. I want full transparency on this, and I want Jake and Mike in my office tomorrow for a formal disciplinary review." Keller nodded, his face grim. "Understood, Chief. I'll start pulling the files." As Keller left, Danny felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a step. With Keller's reluctant support, he knew he could start to make real headway in untangling the network of complacency that had allowed Jake, Mike, and their allies to hold so much sway over Copperfield. The next morning, Danny prepared for his meeting with Jake and Mike, who had finally reported in after avoiding the station for the past 2 days. Danny's mind raced as he went over the complaints he had uncovered, each one a damning reminder of the unchecked power these men had wielded for years. When they entered his office, both wearing expressions of barely concealed contempt, Danny knew he was facing a pivotal moment. "Take a seat," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake and Mike exchanged a glance, their postures defiant, but they sat down. Danny looked at them for a long moment, letting the silence settle heavily in the room before he spoke. "I've spent the last few weeks reviewing complaints from the community," he began, his gaze unwavering. "Your names come up repeatedly in reports of harassment, intimidation, and unprofessional conduct. Can you explain why that is?" Jake's mouth twisted into a sneer. "You're really going to listen to those people? A bunch of complainers who got nothing better to do than make us look bad." Danny's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Those complainers, as you call them, are citizens of Copperfield. They deserve respect and protection, not harassment." Mike crossed his arms, his voice laced with resentment. "We've been doing this job long before you showed up, Chief. We know this town, and we know how to keep things under control." Danny's voice remained calm, but carried a weight that silenced their protests. "This isn't about control. It's about trust. And right now, the people of Copperfield don't trust us. If you think that you can continue to operate outside of the standards I'm setting, you're mistaken. You have a choice. Get in line with the new protocols and treat people with the respect they deserve, or face the consequences. Jake's face flushed with anger. Consequences. You think you can just waltz in here and tear everything down. You don't understand this place, Chief. People don't want change. They like things the way they are. Danny's gaze didn't waver. Maybe they don't know any other way. But I'm here to give them that option. Now, I'm placing both of you on probation, effective immediately. You'll be under close supervision, and any further misconduct will result in termination. Do I make myself clear? Jake looked like he was on the verge of an outburst, but Mike placed a hand on his arm, urging him to stay calm. They both nodded, though their expressions made it clear this battle was far from over. As they left his office, Danny knew he had just poured gasoline on a fire that had been smoldering for years. But he didn't regret it. Change required confrontation, and he was prepared for the fallout. That evening, as Danny walked back to his apartment, he noticed a familiar face sitting on the stoop outside his door. It was Marnie Alvarez, the mother of the boy he'd rescued from Jake and Mike's harassment. She looked anxious, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Marnie," Danny said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" She looked up, relief and worry mingling in her eyes. "Chief Barrett, I just wanted to thank you for what you did for Javier. No one's ever stood up for us like that before." Danny offered a reassuring smile. "You don't need to thank me, Marnie. That's my job." She hesitated, glancing down the street, as if expecting someone to appear. "It's not just that, Chief. Word's been going around town that certain people aren't happy with what you're doing. People with influence. I thought you should know." Danny's expression darkened. "Who's been saying that?" Marnie shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say, but folks are talking. Some are grateful, but others, they're angry. They think you're tearing apart their town, that you're bringing trouble." Danny took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the town's expectations pressing down on him. "Thank you for telling me, Marnie. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but it means a lot to know there are people who understand why I'm here." She gave him a small, hopeful smile. "There are more of us than you think, Chief. Just be careful. This town has a way of protecting its own, and they don't like outsiders making waves." As she walked away, Danny felt a renewed sense of purpose. Marnie's words reminded him that he wasn't just fighting against corruption. He was fighting for the people who had been silenced for too long, the ones who had lived in fear of speaking up. The next day, Danny arrived at the station to find a large crowd gathered outside. At first, he thought it might be a protest, but as he moved closer, he realized it was something far more significant. Citizens of Copperfield, young and old, from every walk of life, had come together, holding signs that read, "Accountability for all," and "We stand with Chief Barrett." It was a quiet, peaceful show of support, but it spoke volumes. Danny felt a surge of gratitude as he walked through the crowd, nodding in acknowledgement to those who offered him words of encouragement. The people of Copperfield were beginning to find their voices, and it was clear that they had placed their trust in him. Inside the station, Jake and Mike were visibly shaken by the display, their usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. Keller watched the scene unfold with a thoughtful expression, as if reconsidering his own stance in this new era of accountability. Danny called the officers together for a brief meeting, addressing them with a renewed sense of authority. "What you saw outside today isn't just about me. It's about the people of this town demanding the respect they deserve. We are here to serve them, not control them. And from this day forward, that's exactly what we're going to do." Jake and Mike exchanged a look, their expressions tense, but they remained silent. They could see the tide turning, and Danny could sense that even they were beginning to understand that their old ways wouldn't hold up under this new scrutiny. For the first time since he'd arrived in Copperfield, Danny felt a glimmer of hope that his efforts would bear fruit, that he was finally breaking through the walls of complacency and corruption that had stifled this town for so long. As Danny left the station that evening, he glanced back at the precinct, feeling a sense of pride and purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew that the road ahead was still fraught with challenges, that there would be more battles to fight. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, that the people of Copperfield were standing with him. The reckoning had come, and Danny was ready. He would carry the weight of this town's past on his shoulders, determined to forge a future defined not by fear and intimidation, but by respect, justice, and the unwavering belief that even the darkest places could find the light.